Graham. I have a PhD in myth and contemporary fantasy fiction, which is the topic. The general subject area is religious studies. I also do some work in the Gothic. Now, this is my standard, slightly cliched caveat in which I say I'm not actually a Gothicist. That is not my training. However, like many Gothicists, I found my way into the Gothic through the research that I do in fantasy. Lots of people find it in other ways, but mine was in research and fantasy, and I focus particularly on the contemporary period. So I do contemporary fantasy, and I also, in the main, do contemporary Gothic. But one of the other things about me is that I was a dancer from the age of 3. That was when I attended my first class, and I danced ballet, tap, and modern, and I have RAD and ISTD amateur qualifications, and I got pretty much all the way to the through the pre-professional qualifications, a few more exams, and I would have been into professional qualification territory. But instead I went to uni to study English literature. But working in the Gothic and in fantasy and the contemporary period has allowed me to bring these things together. And so today I am very pleased that you're here to listen to me talk about Ballet Gothic or Gothic Ballet. I forgot to hit the slide share button when I did that. Okay, here we go. Oh, that's my desktop. That's my little girl. So here we are. So today I am going to be discussing, my talk is Danse Macabre, ballet, Gothic ballet from Swan Lake to Black Swan. So here's the outline of the talk for today. So I'm going to start by discussing some terminology, both from ballet and from the Gothic. You might be more familiar with some of the terminology from the Gothic if you've been attending the class, Sam's class throughout the series, but I'm going to assume that you're not quite as familiar with the ballet terminology. And then I'm going to move on to look at the romantic origins of Gothic ballet, where we'll look at some of the original romantic ballets and the Gothic elements in there. And then I'm going to talk to you about Swan Lake and the Gothic specifically. We'll move on to looking at ballet on film, specifically the Red Shoe, so that's quite a quick section. And then I'm moving on to what is going to be the biggest section of the talk, which is the point shoe and the Gothic body. About halfway through that, it will probably hit the time when you're all going to want a break, and I'm going to need to stretch. So we'll have about a 5 to 10 minute break around about then. And when we come back, we'll continue with the point shoe and the Gothic body. And then after that, we'll get to move on to some actual Gothic ballets, and then look at Black Swan and the body and trauma. And there's a very short postscript, which goes slightly beyond what I promised in the title, but which will look at Suspiria. So starting with the terminology, from ballet, these are the terms that I will in the main use within the talk today. And the kind of most important one is choreography. Now, you might have heard that before because it's not particularly a ballet terminology so much as it's a dance term. And what we mean by choreography is the actual steps, patterns and grouping of steps that make up a ballet or dance. And you will generally find that there is a choreographer behind a classical ballet or even some of our more modern ballets. There tends to be a head choreographer behind that. We'll be talking about on point, which is the shortened form of sur les points, which literally translates from the French to on the points, but it means to dance on the toes, and that's another one that you'll probably be aware of. Again, tutu is a skirt made of net, but quite importantly, it's of varying lengths and it's generally worn in classical ballet. Corps de ballet is what I find quite a Gothic term in and of itself, and it means the dancers in the ballet that dance as a group, usually in some respect in the background. They're not the primas and they're not the soloists, generally speaking, and they support the solo dancers. It's also a rank within the ballet company structure, so you can move up from the corps to soloist to principal. And then we have pas de deux, pas de trois, or pas de quatre. Pas de literally means dance of, and then it's dance of 2, 3, or 4 in those instances. So pas de deux is a dance of 2, which means generally it's the 2 principal dancers, usually male and female, although sometimes pas de deux are single sex. But that's generally, you will always find a pas de deux within a classical ballet. You also get pas de trois, which is a dance of 3. That's quite notably used in Dracula. And a pas de quatre, probably the most famous pas de quatre is the interlinking arms of the swans in Swan Lake. And they do a lot of intricate head movements. So that's probably the one, if I remember correctly, it was in the Vicar of Dibley with men. So it's normally a very recognisable pas de quatre. A pirouette, which literally just means to spin, and it's either going to be on the spot on one leg, or it's going to be travelling using both legs. And a fouetté, which we will come to when we discuss Swan Lake, is a whipping movement with the leg, usually during a pirouette. It's quite a technical move, and it propels the dancer faster. You also see it in ice skating. So here's some visual representations of those. That is, here we have this is on point, using point shoes. So again, you'll probably have been familiar with what that looks like. So that's the technical terminology. And these are 2 tutus. This is a romantic tutu, which is the longer one. And this is the traditional one, which is the stiffer, shorter tutu. Moving on to some of the terminology that I'm going to discuss today. In terms of the Gothic, here we have, to start with, doppelganger, literally meaning double goer, and it's the double or alter ego of the protagonist, often with traits both complementary and antithetical to the character. So that's quite important for actually quite a lot of Gothic ballet. Unheimlich is the Freudian term for discomfort felt by finding familiarity within the unknown, the external, and the other. That's also generally referred to as the uncanny. I will use abject today, and I'm using it in the Christaven sense, which is disgust felt for anything that is ambiguously located at the physical boundaries of the self, neither clearly inside nor outside us, and I tend to use it in relation to the body specifically. And then we have the sublime and the grotesque, and the definition for the sublime is definitely cribbed from the Literary Dictionary, a quality of awesome grandeur in art or nature, because I find it personally quite difficult to explain the sublime. So I've borrowed someone else's words for that. I tend to find that the sublime for me is more of a feeling and a bit more difficult to pin down. And then the grotesque, which is reasonably self-explanatory, I would say, characterized by bizarre distortions, especially in exaggerated or abnormal depiction of human features. So, Gothic ballet. What is there such a thing, I guess? So this is what we're going to talk about today. When thinking about this talk recently, I rewatched the Twilight movies for fun, as you do. And this scene in particular sprang to mind when I was starting to put my slides together for the talk today. So this is from Twilight, and this is the scene where James the vampire is hunting Bella, because he's obsessed with the fact that she's a human and she's with Edward. And the place he chooses for his showdown with Bella and hopefully with Edward is her old ballet studio. Despite the fact that Bella, being intensely clumsy, hardly attended ballet for any time and doesn't really have that much of a connection with the place. So why did James choose this one? Well, he chose it because of the aesthetics, the mirrors, the lighting, and there is something Gothic about the number of mirrors in a ballet studio, and we all know that vampires love their aesthetics. So generally speaking, my previous research on Gothic Ballet has focused on fictional depictions of ballet on film, but today, as I have a little bit more time, I'm going to also cover live ballet performances. So for me, there are three different aspects to Gothic ballet. The first is where we locate the Gothic elements within a classical ballet. The second is modern ballets which adapt Gothic texts or introduce Gothic tropes or elements to classical ballets. Now, the first of those would be something like Northern Ballet's Dracula, which adapts a Gothic text. Whereas for the second, you're looking kind of more at something like Matthew Bourne's Sleeping Beauty, which takes a traditional classical ballet and introduces Gothic elements to it. Bourne introduces the idea that their Sleeping Beauty is cursed by vampirism, not just by sleeping. And the third, and this is what is kind of my original take on Gothic ballet, I guess, is the way in which agony and ecstasy combine within the art of ballet itself, at the centre of which is the Gothic body of the ballerina. So the romantic origins of Gothic ballet, as in all things Gothic, the romantic is not particularly far behind, or should that be the other way around? Unsurprisingly, ballet's Gothic origins lie within the romantic ballets of the 19th century, which were usually inspired by Germanic folklore. The first of these, the Ballet Blancs, as they are known, is La Sylphide, and we also have Giselle and Coppeia. These ballets combined that long romantic tutu, point work, and soft gas lighting to emphasize the unearthly movement of the ballerina. And La Sylphide is where point work itself originated. This is the first romantic ballet. And up until that point, well, it's point work as we know it today. Up until that point, no pun intended, point work had only really been an acrobatic effect where dancers were up on point for a few minutes with lots of flailing arms, and then they were back dancing on flat feet. For La Sylphide, this all changed, and it became much more of a technique and much more of a controlled and practiced exercise, and it became linked in with the ballet choreography itself. And this was for prima ballerina Marie Taglioni, who shortened her tutu to draw attention to her feet on point. And the La Sylphide was actually written for her by her father. So what we have here as well in these ballets is that you find the female protagonists are some form of Gothic other. They are ghosts, spirits, animated dolls, and witches. So La Sylphide is a spirit, Giselle is something of a ghost, Coppeia is an animated doll, and most of them, the ballets have a witch in there somewhere. And you find that all of these women are betrayed by their men. I think that's quite an important point to remember as we go forward. So what you find in the romantic ballets is perfect technique and exceptional physical exertion. And the epitome of this, that incorporates this eerie floating movement of the ballerina, is Giselle, which is pictured here. In Giselle, the Willis, the spirits of maidens betrayed by their lovers, usually on their wedding day, hence the veil, lure men to their death. Now this happens in Act 2, but the Gothic elements of Giselle surface much earlier in Act 1. Where the beautiful but fragile Giselle, there we are. The beautiful but fragile Giselle is confronted by the betrayal of her intended, a nobleman masquerading as a peasant in order to woo her, while he is betrothed to another woman who is actually of his own class. When this betrayal is revealed, Giselle goes mad. And this is a clip from that scene from Act 1, the mad scene. So here we have Giselle Giselle discovering that this is the woman that Albrecht, her intended, is married to. All but ignores her at this stage. And you can see, particularly in Giselle, this is a very emotive ballet. We use a lot of mime. And in this particular clip, what we see is Giselle at first distraught at her discovery, and then she starts to come to, and this is when she starts acting erratically, and this is when you see as it were, the madness descend. What happens is later in this scene, once she begins not accepted, but once she moves on from her initial madness, I'm distracted by the dancing a little bit. She starts to fantasize, and what you can see here is this is her beginning to imagine and remember the courtship between her and Albrecht. And what she does in this stage, what you hear there, the music, is a return of the music from the pas de deux between Giselle and Albrecht earlier in the act. So this is her reminiscing and imagining their courtship and the pas de deux that they did together earlier on. And the way in which the rest of the corps reacts to Giselle as if they are inspired by her is kind of a foreshadowing of her future as one of the Willis. And this is part of the mime of Giselle, where what we see her here doing is, he loves me, not picking the petals off of a flower. And we really see, you get the impression that she doesn't actually even see anyone that's around about her anymore. And this is very much part of the choreography and the style of Giselle as a ballet. Now, depending on the version, what happens at the end of this scene is that Giselle either dies because, as we've learned earlier on in the ballet, she has a weak heart and her heart can't take it when she finds out the betrayal, or she stabs herself with Albrecht's sword, which is the way that he's been discovered as a nobleman, because peasants don't have fancy swords. That second option, where Giselle stabs herself, is the one that this revival of the Royal Ballet chose to go with. And that then gives some narrative explanation as to why Giselle is laid to rest in the forest in unhallowed ground and not in a grave with her family, as she would normally be in a traditional plot. In Act 2, Giselle's spirit is awakened by Mirtha, the queen of the Willis, and Albrecht, mourning by her grave in the forest, begs forgiveness from Giselle's spirit. Now, this is a slightly different version. So it's the same choreography, but this is a different cast here. So this pas de deux in Act 2 is Natalia Osipova and Carlos Acosta. And in this particular version, I think you really see how expressive the dancers are. Now, this is where you can see that ghostly movement, and where the point shoe and the tutu itself, as well as the lighting and the setting, leads to a very ethereal and floating movement in the ballerina. Now, this is exceptionally difficult technically. The control required to move as slowly as Osipova is moving is particularly difficult. What I think is interesting, you can also see here, is the temporal difference between Giselle, who is moving quite quickly in a sense, and Albrecht, who is still standing still. So we see that they at the moment exist on two different temporal planes. Now, these two dancers are almost in effect dancing to two different beats at the moment. And we see this change as they dance together and apart again. And I think this is where you can also see that Acosta is a much more expressive ballerina, male dancer, than we saw in the previous clip, and even on the one that you could see. This is currently available to watch on Sky Arts, and it's not this cast. And I think that this is definitely the better version of this. And Carlos Acosta is just a wonderfully expressive dancer. Now, what you see here with Costa supporting Osipova is that in effect, the majority of the work is being done by her. Although it looks like he's holding her up a lot, all he's doing is allowing her to extend her lines a lot more. The technique for male dancers is generally in the lift, as you can see there. However, they do work in partnership in a pas de deux, where if her technique is not good, if her weight is not properly balanced, he won't be able to properly lift. And there you definitely saw the difference. You saw how quickly she embraces, and it takes him a lot longer to do so, even when they're dancing together. And Osipova is just an absolutely spectacular dancer. I mean, both of her legs are basically in a vertical split there. It's less easy to see that with the skirts, but that does give the ethereal and ghostly motion. It's almost inhuman. And that bourrée there, which is the drumming of the feet in a fast movement on point, that's a very typical movement on point, but it's one that allows the ballerina to appear as if she's floating. There's very little movement in there. And also with that one in particular, it's where you see the technique with Giselle. That could make a lot of noise because you are drumming your feet quite hard into what is a wooden sprung stage. If you are not extremely careful, and if you're not very mindful of your movement, you're going to make a lot of noise. And the Willis are not poltergeists. They're not designed to make a lot. It's not supposed to make a lot of noise, and it's very distracting if that happens. And these lifts are beautifully ethereal, I would say, and that's where you definitely get the ghostliness of Giselle's movement. And here we have that temporal split again, where Acosta is moving significantly slower, and we see Osipova coming behind with that bourrée movement again, basically floating along. And this particular moment, this is, as far as Osipova is concerned, this is forgiveness, which is what Giselle, the ballet, is about for her. There's a lovely piece on the Royal Ballet's YouTube where she talks about what Giselle means. So there has been some work done on Giselle as a Gothic ballet, and this is a quote from one of the pieces, and I think this is from Jana Barro Gonzalez. I think it's worth reading out here. In a sense, Giselle, with all its Gothic content, has come to embody passion for ballet itself. Many ballets have intradiegetic dancing scenes. Folk dances or royal balls are a common feature, but in Giselle, the very act of dancing has a key role. The protagonist, after all, is characterised by her love for dancing, and so are the Willis. Even if dancing is read as a metaphor for sex or a wilder, unconventional heart, it is clear that the maddening, unsettling force of dancing is at the centre of this text. Although recently revived in its original form, Suicide and All by the Royal Ballet, Giselle, of all the classical ballets, is something of a cliché in the company repertoire. In Flesh and Bone, Stars/Amazon's 2015 ballet series, the director, Paul Grayson, pleads with new chairman not to do Giselle, but to do something new. Giselle, he says, has been done to death. You couldn't resuscitate that thing with a defibrillator. I think that's an interesting aspect just to think about. Moving on to discuss Swan Lake and the Gothic. Swan Lake is one of the most physically demanding ballets to perform for the lead as well as for the corps. Odette is cursed by Rothbart and turned into a swan. Discovered by Prince Siegfried in the evening as she returns to human form, they fall in love, they dance a lovely pas de deux, and she reveals that the only way the curse can be broken is by one who has never loved before. In the infinite wisdom of all such fairy tales, Siegfried decides that the answer is to throw a massive ball where he will declare his love for Odette and break the curse. Rothbart discovers this and traps Odette, stopping her from going to the ball. And what he does is he sends his daughter Odile in Odette's place. Now, the narrative is a little bit ambiguous here. We're not entirely sure. He either transforms his daughter so that she looks like Odette, or she already resembles Odette enough that she can go as herself to the ball, which I think both of them are extremely Gothic, but I think the second one is exceptionally incestuously Gothic. At the ball, Siegfried dances with Odile. They have a lovely time, and Siegfried then declares his love for the wrong woman. In declaring his love for Odile, he curses Odette to be a swan forever. Rather than live life as a swan, Odette, in some productions, drowns herself. In other productions, we have the happily ever after ending, which replaces the dance of the dying swan at the end with Siegfried and Odette triumphant over Rothbart. I do not approve of this ending in the ballet. I like me a dead swan. The Dance of the Dying Swan is a lovely piece to dance, and I think it is a shame to waste that on a twee happily ever after ending. As far as I'm concerned, that ending should be saved for the Swan Princess. And my urge, my need for a dead swan, I would like you to kind of bear in mind when we come to discuss Black Swan later. Now, in terms of the Gothic in Swan Lake, the lead ballerina usually dances both Odette and Odile. Not all companies do this. Sometimes they switch out the dancer because it is an exceptionally physically demanding part to play both the White Swan and the Black Swan. But the Royal Ballet version here, I'm not sure if you can actually see it from the pictures, but the version here does use the same ballerina for both the White Swan and the Black Swan. What you can see in the pictures, that it's the same Siegfried in both, and that it's the same costuming, except for one's white and one's black, is the difference in style and attitude of the dancer when she is Odette than when she is Odile. Odette is much softer, she's much more innocent and sweet. Odile is much more provocative, and she has much stronger lines. The difference between the leg bent around Siegfried as opposed to straight out in front of him in the second one. And particularly the Black Swan is a technically challenging part. It has a section in it where the ballerina, having just done a solo performance on point, then does 32 fouettes in a row, pirouettes, and then goes back into doing more point work. And it's exceptionally difficult and exceptionally tiring. Appropriately, the Gothic doubling in Swan Lake is twofold. We have Odette and Odile, but we also have that dual role of the ballerina. As Black Swan picks up on, these are two very different characters and very different dance styles. So moving on from there, we can look at ballet on film rather than live performances. And the first, arguably, of these is The Red Shoes. It's a 1948 adaptation of the fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen, and this has Moira Shearer in the lead role of Victoria. The Red Shoes become something of a prototype or blueprint for the ballet movie that would reach the height of popularity in the early 2000s. Things like Centre Stage, Save the Last Dance, Step Up, and then moving on more recently to Black Swan and Flesh and Bone. It follows the sexual politics of the ballet company, where a tension between romantic love and love for dance is explored. In the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, the protagonist Karen is punished for wearing her red shoes to church and for also going out to dance when she should be staying home and taking care of her ailing mother. What happens is she's cursed to dance in her red shoes until she dies. And in the end, it's so painful and so difficult that Karen chooses to chop off her own feet instead of continue to dance. She does this and collapses in front of a church door, where she repents of her sins, and as she dies, she is born to heaven by an angel. You gotta love Andersen. In lots of death. In the fairy tale, the symbolism is generally interpreted as about the dangers of female sexuality, about the dangers of going out to dance when you should be doing what you're supposed to do, which is staying at home and looking after your parents. Red shoes are therefore symbolic of female sexual maturity, and we see this picked up in many other texts after Andersen's tale and The Red Shoes, the film. And the symbolism is kind of the same in the film, as Victoria, thankfully for me, they changed the name of the character, would rather reprise her role in the titular ballet than return home to her husband. And this is at the root of her demise. Dance is about excessive female sexuality, and the Gothic is all about excess. So moving on to discuss the point shoe and the Gothic body. So this particular image here is from photographer Erwin Olaf, and he did this series for Dutch Ballet's 50th anniversary season. There's a link on the slide. I have mentioned I have sent the link in my Twitter. You'll be able to click on that and have a look at some of the other images within there. He also has an image of Giselle. Now in this is extremely bad technique for point work. She's over her foot. The shoe is brand new. It's not tied on. It's not darned or cut at the end. And I don't know, in that sense, what someone is doing pulling her foot. However, it is an exceptionally beautiful image, and it does show some of the strains of point work. And so thinking about the point shoe and the Gothic body, in Body Gothic Corporeal Transgression in Contemporary Literature and Horror Film, Xavier Aldana Reyes notes that the Gothic is experienced in the flesh, in its surfaces and crevices, and thus reveals its inherent and universal inscriptability. Dance utilizes the contra-natural and the contra-intuitive movement of the body and depicts the uncanny body evoked through movement. Ballet arguably does this more than other dance forms, as the effort required to push the dancer's body to extremes to produce this uncanny movement visually manifests in the point shoe. So thinking now a little bit about the abject nature of the point shoe. The point shoe is external to and an extension of the dancer's body. It's a receptacle for bodily fluid, blood, sweat, and pus, as the friction between the stiffened block and the few toes the dancer ballets on interact, and that causes rupture of the skins. So within the point shoe, what we can see is this tension between the sublime and the grotesque. And I think this image is particularly useful for displaying that. When you see the outside of that very pristine and clean, pretty point shoe versus what is going on underneath that, you can see that this ballerina is balancing pretty much on two toes. Depending on the structure of your foot, you're either balancing on two or at most three. You're not going to be balancing on all of those. And so the dancer's body is the locus of this tension, to the extent actually that particularly amateur dancers will attempt to alter their own bodies to counteract this effect. As an amateur dancer, I was advised to rub surgical spirit on my toes when I was starting point work. And the point there is the reason for that is to toughen up the skin to try and stop these blisters from happening. However, that doesn't always work. These are my actual point shoes. I think these were my first pair, they might be my second. I danced Cinderella in these shoes, and these are Freeds, which is what most people start on. So this is amateur dance's effect on the point shoe. You can see that that's not clean and pristine. You can see the creases from where I've gone on point with these. You can see the wear and tear. These are darned. Professional dancers tend not to darn their shoes. Amateurs are taught to darn their shoes, where we use a curved needle and we sew a linking stitch in beautifully intricate circles on the bottom of the block, and that's to give them more strength and to get them to wear longer. Professional dancers tend not to do that very much. They tend to rip off the satin and burn the edges so that they can get straight in to dancing. You can also see, some of the glue here as it started to melt and come out from underneath the sole, and you can quite frankly see the effects on the inside of the shoe of the sweat of my feet. I'm sure you all signed up for this. I have lost toenails and skin to point work. So that's what happens to an amateur's foot, and that's what happens to an amateur's shoe. Imagine what professional feet and professional shoes go through. I would say that's more skin and more toenails. In order to actually dance within the point shoe, professional dancers tend to break their shoes. So this is a visual image of the sequences that you would go through to break in a brand new point shoe. So as you can see in this first shot here, the curvature there, that's the point that the dancer is looking for. If you look just below it at the back of the point shoe, that back is fairly solid and is not going to allow you to point your foot to that extent. So what do? You rip it open and you cut it out. This is called shanking the shoe. And what you are then able to do, as you can see it bends significantly easier there, is you're able to point. What professional dancers also then do is they break the block. Now that block is what's helping support your toes as you go on point. In order to break that in, most amateurs do it the hard way, where we roll up on our feet and we rise onto point and we go back down, and we do that a lot. And that is where some of the initial friction comes, and that's how you learn to do point work. Eventually, the glue softens, it molds to your feet, and you're able to move around in the point shoe, and you're able to point your feet, which is exceptionally important for ballet. Professional dancers don't have time to break in point shoes. So what they do is they physically break the block. They will jam it indoors, they will stand on it. Sometimes they get their slightly heavier partners to stand on it. They're normally their dance partners. And you also will sometimes find that they will wet the sides of the shoe just before they dance in it when they're starting to break it in, which helps mold it to their feet. This is why I would argue that you rarely find a fictional depiction of the ballerina on screen that does not show them breaking in their point shoes and their point shoes breaking them back, where we see toenails come off. That's quite famous in Centre Stage, it's in Flesh and Bone, it's in Black Swan. As with the red shoes, this ubiquitous depiction of bleeding and damaged feet is the visual manifestation of ballet's Gothic heart, and where in the red shoes this combined dance, female sexuality and bodily excess, this is often carried on in the ballet movies. Breaking, and that's actually, there we are. Once the point shoe is broken in, what actually helps the dancer go on point is not actually the toes. So the strength doesn't come from the toes, and I think this is partly as well why the point shoe is so evocative of the Gothic within ballet, is that although on the surface you think the shoe's doing a lot of work, or the toes or the foot is doing a lot of work. In actual fact, the thing that holds you up is your muscles in your back, your muscles in your stomach, your muscles down your thighs. Most of the work is done in the rest of the body, and not just in the toes itself. And since I have probably icked you out significantly now with this talk of broken feet and missing toenails, I think it's probably a good time to have a little bit of a break. So what we did this morning, and what I think we will do today, this evening as well, is have about a 5-minute break. I'll stop sharing my screen. I will stand up and stretch and have a glass of water, and we will continue with more point shoe and the Gothic body at, shall we say, 10 to?
Popping the recording back on. So if you don't want to be pictured, then turn your picture off. And yeah, I'll hand back over to Karen. And I feel like everybody's going to be wanting a break in my classes now, but I might do that. I think it's a good idea.
We had this discussion earlier. Okay, here we go. Yes, fun head. Okay. The problem with closing your notebook. There we go. So moving on to something which, even if you have seen some of my Gothic ballet talks before, you probably won't have seen this, because I discovered this about 3 days ago on the BBC iPlayer and just had to put it into my talk today. So this is a creative short called Anatomy of a Crooked Spine by Kate Morrison. Now the blurb on the screen is lifted directly from the BBC iPlayer website. I'm just going to play this. So this is a short choreographed piece where the dancer and a piece of industrial rope is used to discuss and illustrate the impact of spinal fusion surgery, the correct curvature of the spine for those affected by scoliosis. So we see the screen, the shot moving between the dancer dancing with the rope and in a facsimile of that surgery being done on the industrial rope here. And it is that's quite a difficult thing to watch, I find, knowing that that is just a piece of rope. Nonetheless, because of the way that the choreographed piece evokes the spine when they move together, you don't feel that. You don't feel it's just a piece of rope, and the way that the dancer moves with that rope. And what we have in the music is quite an atonal sound, so it's quite discordant. It's hard to recognise it even as music. It's more of a soundtrack at this point. But as we go on and the dancer moves more and more with the rope, and more is done to the spine, we see they begin to move together. We see that the surgery begins to take shape, and there's much more fluid movement from the dancer at this point. And this is where we see she begins to break free from the rope. And around about here, the music starts to change. And what's coming in now is that's from the Nutcracker Suite. And we see that on the cusp of the two different, the black and the white room. And then she dances freely, even up pirouettes. And I think that that is a beautiful example of the point shoe, ballet, and the Gothic body. Moving on, the point shoe and the Gothic body and the political. So in 2019, this skill here is from the start of the Danceworks Ballet Black documentary that's currently on the iPlayer. British rapper Stormzy was the main event at Glastonbury. And halfway through his set, he treated the audience to something a little different. We saw a performance from Ballet Black, and behind the two black dancers on the stage at Glastonbury, in amongst all of the dry ice and the fog, a large screen shows the text, "Ballet shoes have traditionally not been made to match black skin tones until now." And then Stormzy introduces Ballet Black. He performs and they dance at the front of the stage. And it was a particularly swift introduction for popular culture to Ballet Black, which a lot of people might not have been aware of. Ballet Black is a company in the UK which is set up specifically for dancers of colour, because ballet as an art form and as an industry is overwhelmingly white. And it's overwhelmingly elitist. So to see a black British rapper display black ballet in skin tone, wearing skin tone appropriate shoes and costuming is really quite provocative and profound. And I think that that begins to epitomise what might be the next stage in the point shoe and the Gothic body, where we see this shift from the locus of the point shoe as a physical pane of ballet into a symbolic use. These are two black dancers, both 14, who protested outside in front of the monument of Confederate General Robert E. Lee during the Black Lives Matter protests that are still ongoing. And the link here is a YouTube video which interviews Kennedy George and Ava Holloway, who took this. And I think it's really quite important to note that in this image, you can see the two of the different options for point shoes for ballerinas. So one is wearing a black pair of point shoes, whereas the other one is wearing the traditional peach. And you can see what that traditional peach looks like on black skin. And it does stand out a mile away. On my skin, you can't tell the difference. And ballet, in that sense, is made for people that have the skin tone that I do, not necessarily the body type, but that's a different thing altogether. And the fact that they're in their tutus and they have their Black Power salute in front of this monument, I think is exceptionally evocative. And this might be where Ballet Gothic is going. Moving on to talk about some actual Gothic ballets. So these are new ballets with original choreography and sometimes original scores, which are adaptations of what you would consider to be traditionally Gothic texts. Now I'm thinking of things like Northern Ballet's Dracula from 2005, the Royal Ballet's Frankenstein from 2016, and I'm also thinking about a more recent one, which is the Crucible by Scottish Ballet, which I saw last year. The question is, does Gothic source material necessarily mean Gothic ballet? So to talk about Dracula a little bit, the still here that I have, this is from a poster promotion for Northern Ballet's Dracula. This is not the Dracula, the cast of Dracula that you will see on the BBC iPlayer at the moment. There is a version on, it's a slightly different cast. The costuming is slightly different. The ballet itself is the same. What I found quite interesting about Dracula is that they didn't use an original score. They have used scores of existing classical music. Now, one of the reasons for this could be that you don't have to pay extra money for classical pieces because normally they are out of copyright and you can perform them without license. Scores cost money. Composers cost a lot of money. Northern Ballet doesn't quite have the financial clout that someone like the Royal Ballet does. So that's quite a shrewd move, I would say, if that is the reason behind it. I'm only surmising, from Northern Ballet to be able to create a brand new ballet that is accessible, that is based on a Gothic pop culture text, but use existing music. The problem I find with that is that I find that there's a disconnect between the music that I'm listening to and the dance and the movement and the choreography. And I find that because the two haven't gone together, I'm listening to go, oh, that's Dies Irae, for example. So it does kind of diminish it a tad. What I also noticed when watching Dracula was that this isn't just a straightforward ballet. This is a ballet with a mixture of contemporary styles. And the women in Dracula, once they get turned vampiric, come off of point and dance either soft shoe or barefoot. And this is a technique that will be able to see in some other Gothic ballets. And this is also where there's a massive spoiler. So if you have not seen this and you intend to see it, now normally I don't actually mind spoilers. However, they changed the ending of Dracula the Ballet, and I think that last kind of beat of the text is really quite important. So if you haven't seen it and you want to watch it, turn me on mute now. I will wave when you can listen again, okay? So the change for the ending is that Mina, once Dracula is defeated, kills herself, just like Giselle and Odette. And I think that this begins to become a hallmark of the Gothic ballet. In the end, everyone dies. Okay, it's safe. Moving on to Frankenstein, the Royal Ballet's adaptation of Frankenstein, choreographed by Liam Scarlett. Now, this one did have an original score. And as you can see, the costuming and the set design is spectacular and exceptionally Gothic. However, unlike Dracula, this particular ballet was pretty much panned by the critics on its debut. And I find the reasons for that to be quite interesting. The main critique of this as a ballet was that Scarlett expanded the narrative and overemphasized the romantic elements of the ballet, and that the best bits are the very Gothic bits, like where the monster dances on his own. And I find this really interesting, particularly considering that we recently had the National Theatre who screened their Frankenstein with Johnny Lee Miller and Benedict Cumberbatch, and that was an extremely successful run. And that in comparison, the Royal Ballet's Frankenstein ballet was not quite as successful. So what is it about this particular one that makes it not quite as good? And it could be argued that it is okay to have a romantic ballet and amp up the Gothic. But for some reason, when you have a Gothic ballet and you amp up the romance, that is less compelling. It's an interesting one to think of. And moving on to the final Gothic ballet to discuss today. This is Scottish Ballet's adaptation of Arthur Miller's The Crucible. So this is the trailer available on YouTube. Some of the music in this is quite loud. And unlike Dracula, this particular adaptation yeah, you weren't going to hear me over that, really, were you? Unlike Dracula, this has an original score. And when I went to see this, I went to a session prior to the ballet with the conductor, and he discussed how the composer and the choreographer worked really closely together on this piece. And so in a way that I think Dracula misses out on, the movement and the music really work together. Like Dracula, this has contemporary elements as well as traditional ballet movements. The sets and the lighting use shadows and puppetry to kind of ramp up that Gothic atmosphere. And this is particularly an American Gothic, as this is set in the Salem witch trials. It is an adaptation of Arthur Miller's play. And with this, we find that religion comes into the Gothic, which is not my area of expertise. You see Sam for that one. But this is definitely explores that aspect of it. We see dance and female sexuality intertwined again with the girls in Salem. And as each woman is accused of witchcraft, she comes off point and dances barefoot, just like in Dracula. And I think that that's an interesting inversion from what we have seen in traditional ballets with Gothic edges, is that Gothic ballets, the point shoe is seen as something more traditional and barefoot is seen as more free. But still, there is that tension between the two. We also find that there are temporal disruptions in this, like in Giselle. There are moments where time moves differently and the dancers go much more slowly, particularly during accusations within the court. And everyone dies in the end. That's not a spoiler for The Crucible, really, I'm sure. So moving on to discussing Black Swan and the body in trauma. So Darren Aronofsky's thriller Black Swan revisits the format of the ballet movie that we saw in The Red Shoes. It plays on the Gothic doubling within Swan Lake and expresses the physical and mental strains of a ballerina attempting one of the most demanding roles in ballet. This too has the scene of breaking in the point shoes, accompanied by images of bleeding and blistering feet. There is more to the Gothic than this. This is Nina's last chance in the ballet company to be a soloist. Her mother had to stop dancing when she got pregnant with Nina. The implication in the movie is that this was with the company director and that Nina's mother gave up her career in order to have Nina. And she has, therefore, we feel, projected her want and love of dance onto Nina. So this is the opening scene of the movie. In soft pinks. That's a distinct contrast from this monochromatic colour palette that we see in the dream sequence. And this shows the disconnect between Nina's internal self and her identity enforced upon her by her mother. And this is the main theme of the film. Living in a small apartment with her mother, Nina barely has the independence to travel to the ballet studio on her own. She is timid, and of her voice barely more than a high-pitched whisper, and she is infantile. Now, interestingly, Portman had a bit of an issue with the requirements for her voice for this part. So Portman does have quite a childlike, breathy voice, and that's quite obvious in some of her earlier parts. And she did start as a child actress. And up until this point in her career, she had been working on adapting that into a much stronger and more forceful voice. She felt that the timid, breathy voice wasn't indicative of her, and it wasn't necessarily landing her roles that she wanted. She had to take a step back for Black Swan in order to do that. And I find that quite an interesting take, and just an interesting kind of tidbit. We see her mother dress Nina, and when she calls to tell her mother that she's been cast as the White Swan, she sniffles and whines, "He picked me, Mommy." In the following scene, where after she has been cast as the White Swan, where Nina's mother has bought a large celebration cake, which is thick with pink frosting and sugar roses and a plastic ballerina on top. And as her mother cuts into the cake, Nina gets visibly more and more anxious, leading her to repeatedly plead for a smaller piece, ending with the lie of, "My stomach's still in knots." Nina's mother's reaction to this is swift and extreme, as she declares the cake garbage if Nina is not able to eat it and goes to throw it in the bin. While I don't have the time to fully explore the implications of this scene, it is doing an awful lot of work in the narrative in portraying the relationship. We don't actually see Nina and her mother on screen very often, but when we do, those interactions do a lot. Nina's disordered eating, which is considered almost to an extent normal in the ballet world, the excessive worry about calories. And not being the body type for dance. Her mother's expectations of her career and the speed at which Nina acquiesces in order to de-escalate the situation indicates to the viewer that this is an abusive relationship. A lot has already been written about Black Swan as a Gothic thriller, and while critical attention has focused on the film as Gothic light and stopping short of full-on horror, it's nevertheless an established Gothic text in its exploration of the Gothic double. From very early on, Nina is plagued by images of her double. This is heightened by the plethora of mirrors that adorn the walls of the ballet studios and fitting rooms, and the unsettling nature of one's own reflection found there. Nina fears her double, a second self looking to replace her, and these are interpreted as manifestations of underlying psychosis. She's projecting her fears and anxieties onto the mirror image. More so than this, is the physical manifestations of ballet. While it's often interpreted as self-harm in the movie, what I think Nina actually has is a case of dermatillomania. Now, dermatillomania, or a skin-picking disorder, is a compulsion where the individual searches the skin for imperfections and obsessively picks, squeezes, or scratches the skin until they bleed. It's common in those who have acne, but also in those with anxiety. It's distinct from self-harm in that the individual is not always consciously aware of the damage that they inflict on their body. Nina clearly has some form of the condition, as we see her mother discovering scratches on Nina's back and dragging Nina to the bathroom to cut her nails in the effort to stem the ability to continue with the compulsion. Later on in the film, it is these scratches on Nina's back that she doesn't remember making that produce black feathers, eventually transforming her into the Black Swan during her performance. And these scratches are also symbolic of the way that the film resists notions of fixing the text into a puzzle to be solved. Throughout the film, Nina is surprised by the scratches she finds on her back, seeming to be genuinely unaware that she's doing it. As the audience, the violence that Nina inflicts on her body that we are permitted to see usually disappears shortly after Nina has experienced the pain. So I'm thinking of this scene in the bathroom where she starts to pick the skin on her finger. And what we see is, as the audience, is it becomes a large well and bleeds. Once she runs out under the tap and someone else comes in, that disappears. And that's where we start to see, that's where you can see the difference between the beginning of the film, where we're not entirely sure if what Nina is experiencing is reality. Is she actually seeing herself everywhere? Is she seeing her double everywhere? Has she actually scratched her back? Has she actually picked at her skin? To the end of it, where we know from the film and the context that Nina didn't actually sprout feathers and grow wings for her part in the Black Swan, and that this is all in her head. So with all of that in mind, is Black Swan a Gothic ballet? Well, Aronofsky actually originally wanted to adapt Dostoevsky's The Double for Portman, and what we got instead was Black Swan. And like in Giselle, Swan Lake and the Red Shoes, the ballerina dies in the end. I came out of that movie so happy that I got my dead swan. But is it Gothic ballet, or is it a Gothic film that happens to be about a ballerina? I think that's a question. I'm not entirely sure I know the answer yet. I swing different ways depending on when I've seen it, but I think it is really interesting to look at the boundaries of these kinds of texts. So for my final slide here, we have a small postscript on Suspiria. So where is Gothic ballet going? Suspiria is arguably the next big Gothic ballet text. But again, is it? The Argento original was definitely a horror set in a ballet company. The remake is arguably a ballet horror. What's the line between horror and Gothic? What this remake did was turn Argento's horror film set in a ballet studio into a ballet horror, and one of the ways that we see this is that particular scene with Olga trapped in the mirrored audition room while Susie dances. As Susie dances, her movements appear to inflict physical damage upon Olga, whose body becomes mangled and deformed. In terms of Gothic ballet, that's right up there, as we see the new prima as she dances destroying the former prima's body that is broken. And it definitely, I would say, epitomizes the contranatural movement of the ballerina. But there's something slightly off about this Suspiria. And I think it very much epitomized by this quote from Mark Kermode, who, when talking about the film, he does love the Argento original, talks about how it's so much longer than the original, and there's a great 90-minute film in there. Did we really need it to be as long as it was? And he considers it to be weighed down by its own self-importance. So you want more now, right? We want more ballet, we want more ballet Gothic. So these are some resources that you can access at the moment. So on the BBC iPlayer, we have Danceworks Baliblack documentary. You can also see Dracula by Northern Ballet. And if you do watch it, I would love you to tweet and tell me what you think of it. Anatomy of a Crooked Spine came from Dance on Film, BBC Introducing Arts. There's also, in the last couple of days, been Culture and Quarantine's Swan Lake Bath Ballet, which is a 3-minute watch, and it's definitely worth watching. And there's also the Ballet Windrush Movement of the People. Royal Ballet's YouTube channel has a lot of things on there to watch. It's got full ballets, as well as some clips. There's some lovely clips with Darcy Bustle talking to the core dancers in Swan Lake. That's where you will see how a point shoe is made. You'll see Natalia Osipova talking about Giselle. And on Sky Arts at the moment, there is Matthew Bourne's Swan Lake, which is a must watch. There's also a version of the Royal Ballet's Giselle, and there's also a series on Why Do We Dance, which is definitely worth checking out. So that's it from me. Any questions, comments, discussions? Very interested in your thoughts on Gothic Ballet.
Yeah. Don't be shy. Feel free to ask any questions. You can ask them out loud or ask them in the chat as well.
Not a question so much as a comment. Mason found a really interesting. I don't know whether.
Morning, Rish. That's why he showed it in the chat. Yeah. But did you see it, Karen? The one that he showed us, the one he talked about with the knives on the shoes?
Oh yes, I've seen that. Yes. Yes, that's exceptionally interesting from a Gothic ballet perspective. Yes, I've seen that a few times.
Yeah, I don't know if you found the link again, Rish. If you could put it in this chat, that would be amazing. Excellent.
There we go.
Thank you so much. I couldn't watch it. I couldn't make it all the way through. Like I just couldn't. I couldn't do it. It was I don't know what it was about it, but I just couldn't watch it. So just an FYI for people. I don't know. I don't even know what the content warning should be.
I think not so much content warning as it's just an uncomfortable piece to watch.
Mm. You can speak too, Karen.
So that's me just sticking the link to my slides in the chat. Since Gothic Sleeping Beauty, yay. So this is so when I talk about Gothic Sleeping Beauty, that's Matthew Bourne's adaptation of Sleeping Beauty. Now Matthew Bourne is quite a Gothic choreographer, and he is fairly well known for his all-male corps in Swan Lake. And that was quite a revelatory ballet when it came out. More recently, he did an adaptation of Sleeping Beauty. Now, what Bourne did when he was interpreting Sleeping Beauty, he kept the music, but he thought about the text itself and came to the conclusion that it makes much more sense if Sleeping Beauty gets turned into a vampire. And that some of the rest of the cast are vampires. And it's a very interesting one. And I find it quite interesting from a set perspective as well, where if you watch BBC's, Northern Ballet's Dracula, there's a scene with a graveyard, and it's got quite a large kind of Gothic wrought iron gate. That is quite evocative of Bourne's set for Sleeping Beauty, where there's a big gate, wrought iron gate, instead of the kind of tangled forest. And this is what the prince has to, I've not seen that yet. This is where the prince has to work his way through. And I think that it definitely plays on the Gothic elements that were in that text. Whether it narratively makes as much sense to the audience if you don't know that that's what's happening is a question. So I'm not sure it's quite as successful as his Swan Lake, because I find that it takes quite a bit of work to get to, they're vampires. Okay, that's why they're dancing like this, that's why their costumes are like that. And it does take a little bit longer to get there. Then I think you have to do a little bit more work with his Sleeping Beauty than you have to do with his Swan Lake. His Swan Lake makes sense right off the bat. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a good ballet and it's not a good thing, but I think it's an interesting one to look at where we go with the Gothic and how much we can change before it starts to become incomprehensible. I have not yet seen the Royal Opera House's production of Metamorphosis, which someone asked. It is on the list. And I did try to get through some before I did this talk, but I just didn't quite have the time. But I am very much looking forward to watching that. Yes, I thought it might be.
A really quick question. Karen, I was just wondering off the top of your head if there's like a particular Gothic text that has not yet been made into a ballet which would be your favorite choice?
Someone asked me this morning and I still don't know the answer. I should have thought about this a little bit more. And I'm trying to remember, people came up with some really great suggestions in the chat. Someone said that the monk would make an excellent ballet. And I heavily agree. I part of my issue is that I work in fairy tale studies and fantasy. So in the main, all of my texts already are ballets of some sort, and most of them I find the Gothic in the everyday. That is definitely something I think you can do, and so you do find it a lot. I would like to actually, this is not answering exactly your question, but I would like to see someone do a more Gothic treatment of the Nutcracker. The Nutcracker is a lovely ballet. I have seen the Nutcracker someone's just said Ginger Snaps as a ballet in the comments and I might die. That's an amazing idea. That's an amazing idea. Yeah, someone do that, please. Yes, a werewolf ballet, any werewolf ballet would be amazing. I don't think there's been enough of that. I think the Crucible kind of did some of that with Wolves and the Wilderness and American Gothic, and I would like to see someone take that even further. But I would like a Gothic treatment of the Nutcracker. I would like to see what you can do, because it's a very sweet ballet, and it's a very kid-friendly ballet. I would like an adult version. Yeah. Question from Meg, mentioned the politics and elitist nature of ballet, particularly in relation to people of colour. Do I think that the increase of Gothic treatments are pushing some of these boundaries? I think it can do. I think there's a danger there, as there is with the Gothic and the Gothic other and people of colour, is to assume that we are doing the work because we are looking at Gothic others, and that is in effect doing that. Whereas I find it quite problematic to equate the Gothic other with race. I think that the Gothic ballets are more likely to bring in a more popular audience, a less elitist audience. If you show previous, you see traditional ballets and you see the crowd in traditional ballets, it's not quite the same as the crowd that you get to things like Northern Ballet's Dracula or some of the more contemporary texts, because there's almost an understanding around about traditional ballets for posh white people. So you see ballets that are a bit more innovative and a bit looser, and particularly in the smaller, more regional ballet companies. Birmingham Royal Ballet do some, is it Birmingham Ballet? Or is it Birmingham Royal Ballet? I might look that up, do some amazing pieces, and they do a lot with kids as well, and it's something about that kind of grassroots and getting people in that wouldn't normally think of going to the theatre. And I think that the live performances through the cinema of theatre, but ballet as well, have really helped with that, because people who will go to a cinema wouldn't necessarily go to a theatre except for panto. And I think that is something that you see happening more and more. I hope we see so much more of Ballet Black. It is Birmingham Royal Ballet. Thank you, Sam. I don't know Guy Madden's Dracula. It has been mentioned to me. My good friend Simon Bacon said that I should look at that, and I haven't had time. But if you want to tell me about it, I would be very happy to hear about it.
If I could.
Yes.
So going back to what you were talking about, bringing in non-traditional audiences, as someone who doesn't really have a lot of access to live ballet, mainly because of where I'm from, I'm in India, we don't really have ballet companies. So if I want to watch it, I need to be on holiday to a different country. And what I'm really enjoying, especially in theater, is that the lockdowns kind of forced a lot of companies to go online, like to release movie versions, whether that's paid or non-paid. And I think like Hamilton obviously showed how popular it can get, but I think it's really useful to kind of have it more accessible to people who can't physically go to a theater or a ballet, not only because of, you know, location issues, maybe because of price point issues.
Exactly.
So yeah, I'm really enjoying what's been going on with the whole going online trend during lockdown.
I would absolutely agree. I think that live performances of all art forms, but especially ballet, should be much more accessible. And it has been great to see what has come out in lockdown and people starting to think about how they can share digitally. And they're quite often with things like Hamilton, that being on Disney Plus, there's a bit of, particularly in the academic community, there's a bit of dubiety over whether that is a good thing or not. But quite frankly, being able to pay 12 quid and watch one of the hottest tickets in the West End is a really important thing for accessibility, whether it's Disney doing it or not. I found that with the National Theatre, putting the productions online, and also doing set times when they do that so that we can watch as a community. And I do think that the access, particularly price point access, but also just physical access. Not everybody can get into a theatre space. Theatre spaces are still not all that accessible for people with mobility issues. There's normally significant limits there. And even with visual and hearing disabilities, people should still be able to access this, and there is so much that you can do with online content that allows for these things to be accessible. And I do think that if anything positive can be said to come out of this fairly devastating pandemic, it is that we are rethinking the way that we access arts and culture and the importance of arts and culture. And it's really important that these aspects of our culture get supported in ways that don't necessarily rely on, as it were, bums in seats. And we should all be able to access culture this way. And I would be happy to pay on a pay for demand for certain things like this, especially if that allowed other people to see it for free. Ooh. Okay, what's my favourite Gothic ballet skill? Generally, I have to actually say it's things like the physical exertion of the 32 fouettés in Swan Lake. It's Giselle's mad scene. It's for me, it's frantic movement. There's a lot of beautiful ethereal movement in Gothic ballet. But one of the things I really enjoyed about Dracula was the beginning Dracula's serpentine movements and the way that that evokes what we think of as vampires, and generally actually mime in ballet. It can be a bit derided, as mime generally can be, but it's really important for letting the audience actually know what's going on. And if you aren't doing that in some way and making it clear, again, it's not accessible. You shouldn't have to know the story in advance to be able to follow a ballet. And the Dance Theatre of Harlem having a performance of Giselle sounds amazing. There is a version of Giselle. Oh, and this is where I'm just going to quickly go back to my slides so that I get this correct, which was the second image I used of Giselle when I was discussing it. Might be here, Gothic Ballet. Yeah, so it's the English National Ballet's Giselle from 2017. And I'm going to look up the choreographer for that. From Cannes. That's a really interesting adaptation of Giselle. In some respects, it plays more on the Gothic than the Royal Ballet does, and it's definitely a different take. So I would like to see the Harlem one, and I also recommend trying to get a hold of Akram Khan's Giselle as well. There is a ballet of Wuthering Heights, yes. There's also a ballet of Jane Eyre. So there is a lot of Gothic content out there. And actually Liam Scarlett, who did the not quite as successful Frankenstein adaptation, his back catalogue is full of Gothic ballet delights, which is why it was a bit of a surprise that Frankenstein wasn't quite so much of a hit, because he actually had quite a good track record of his previous ballets, none of which I can remember at the moment on the spot, even though I brought that up. But yeah, there's definitely a lot more than what I've talked about today to Gothic ballets. I'm very happy to see recommendations because I doubt I have seen them all.
Karen, just as people are maybe having to leave, I wondered if you could pop the email in your email in the chat, just so people have it. Not to obviously email Karen just willy-nilly, but if you want to contact Karen, she's available on Twitter as well, and you can pop her at there. But if you want to support Karen, that's the email address that goes with the PayPal. I'm just going to turn the recording off, I think, unless anybody has any major questions now, and then we can open it up a little bit to discussion so people can feel comfortable asking by camera.